In the winter of 2011, a documentary photographer named Christian Ferreira drove 340 kilometers across the Patagonian steppe in a truck with a cracked windshield and a fuel gauge he did not trust to reach a site that, officially, he had not been authorized to visit. He carried 2 cameras, 11 rolls of film, a satellite phone that lost signal within the first hour of leaving the provincial road, and a handwritten letter from a retired Argentine paleontologist who had been removed from the excavation the previous year under circumstances that the university involved has never publicly explained. By the time Ferreira drove back out 4 days later, he had used every roll of film. He had also lost 6 pounds, developed a tremor in his left hand that a Buenos Aires neurologist later told him had no identifiable organic cause, and refused for the better part of a week to discuss what he had seen with anyone, including his wife. When he finally did sit down and describe the site, the first thing he said was that the scale of what was lying in that ravine was not something a human being was meant to encounter without preparation. The second thing he said was that he did not believe the bones had been uncovered by erosion. He believed they had been uncovered deliberately a long time ago, and then left exactly where they were for a reason he could not name but could not stop thinking about. What Ferreira photographed in that ravine in the Chubut province has never been formally published. A small number of the images circulated through a private network of researchers between 2012 and 2014. Most of the people who saw those photographs have described the experience the same way, not with excitement, with unease. The site itself had been known, in a limited way, since the late 1990s. A rancher grazing sheep across a dry riverbed had reported exposed bones to the Provincial Geological Survey. The survey sent a team. The team sent a report. The report travelled up through the administrative structure of Argentine science until it reached people with the authority to decide what happened next. And what happened next was that a small, carefully managed excavation was permitted, and then, in 2010, it was not. The excavation was suspended pending a review that has never concluded. The researchers who had been working the site were reassigned. The rancher was compensated for access restrictions to a portion of his land that surrounded the ravine at a radius of roughly 400 metres. The compensation was not small. He took it and did not ask questions, which is a reasonable thing to do when the people writing the cheque are not the kind of people who invite questions. Ferreira got in because of the letter, and because the rancher, a man named Osvaldo Quiroga, had decided that whatever was in that ravine deserved at least one witness who was not on a government payroll. Quiroga walked him to the edge of the site at first light on the second morning. He did not go down into the ravine himself. He stood at the rim, pointed, and then walked back toward the estancia without looking over his shoulder. Ferreira later described that walk as the walk of a man who had already looked enough times. The Patagonian steppe in July is not a landscape that tolerates sentiment. The wind comes off the plateau in sustained horizontal bursts that make it difficult to hold a camera steady and nearly impossible to hear anything beyond it. The cold is not the wet cold of altitude. It is a dry, abrading cold that gets into the joints and slows thought. The ravine sat at the bottom of a drop of roughly 30 metres, accessible by a path that had been cut into the eastern wall, probably by the original survey team, and then not maintained. Ferreira descended it twice. Both times, he said, the wind stopped at the ravine floor, completely, like stepping through a door into a room where the air was different. He noted this in a journal he kept during the 4 days. He noted it not as something remarkable, but as something he wanted on record in case it mattered later. What was in the ravine was bones. The word does not do sufficient work here. Ferreira was not an inexperienced photographer. He had worked in conflict zones. He had photographed mass graves in contexts that had required him to dissociate from what he was looking at in order to function. What he encountered at the floor of that ravine required the same mechanism. The exposed remains ran for a horizontal distance of at least 60 metres along the base of the western wall. The individual elements were massive in a way that resisted immediate comprehension. A single vertebra, partially exposed, stood nearly to his chest. He photographed it with his hand placed against the surface for scale. In the developed image, his hand looks like something a child placed there for a joke. The bone underneath it does not look like geology. It looks structured. It looks intentional. It looks like something that was built to last a very long time. The condition of the exposed material was what generated the first wave of serious, if quiet, controversy among the researchers who eventually saw the photographs. Bones of the age the site would imply should not look the way these bones looked. Fossilization proceeds according to understood chemistry. What Ferreira's images showed did not conform to that chemistry, in ways that at least 3 people with relevant credentials, none of whom would permit their names to be attached to the assessment, described as frankly anomalous. The surfaces were wrong. The density, visible in photographs taken at oblique angles in direct morning light, was wrong. One researcher, in a private email that was later shared without that person's consent, wrote simply that the material looked less like it had turned to stone and more like it had never been anything else. The photographs moved quietly. They were not posted publicly. They were shared by forwarded message, printed and handed across tables, described in language that people used when they were not certain they wanted a written record of their own reaction. Rumours attached to them the way rumours attached to images that refused to be explained. People said the site was larger than what Ferreira had been able to photograph. People said the bones were not all from the same creature. People said that the survey team in the 1990s had found something in the ravine wall itself, something carved, and that finding was the actual reason the review that never concluded had been initiated in the first place. What is not rumour is the timing. Christian Ferreira visited that ravine in July of 2011. His photographs were the last taken by anyone outside of a restricted governmental context. How do we know that? Because 3 months after Ferreira drove back out across the steppe with his cracked windshield and his 11 developed rolls of film, the access radius around the site was extended. The rancher's compensation was renegotiated, and a provincial geological designation was applied to the land surrounding the ravine that effectively made any unauthorized presence on it a criminal matter under Argentine federal statute. Nobody announced this. It appeared in a regulatory filing that nobody outside of a specific administrative office would have had reason to read. The question that has no satisfying answer is what Ferreira's photographs contained that made the people responsible for that ravine decide that no one else should ever be that close to what was inside it. The official reasons for restricting the site have never been stated in one place, which is itself a reason to pay attention. What exists instead is a scatter of justifications, each individually reasonable, each arriving slightly too late to explain the decision it was meant to cover. Preservation is the first argument. Fossil sites in Patagonia have a documented problem with theft. Titanosaur material has appeared in private European collections with paperwork that does not survive close inspection. Bone poachers work the steppe the way artifact hunters work the American Southwest, quietly and with enough geological literacy to know what they are looking at. A site of genuine significance, left unguarded and publicly known, does not stay intact. This is true. It is also true that the standard response to that risk is not a federal criminal designation applied without announcement. The standard response is a fence, a guard, a permit system. What happened at the ravine in Chubut was not preservation management. It was erasure from the accessible record. Those are different operations requiring different levels of institutional will. Land ownership and legal liability offer the next layer of cover. Quiroga's compensation agreement almost certainly contained language that transferred something beyond simple access rights. In Argentina, paleontological material discovered on private land is legally the property of the state, which means the state's obligation to that material is total, and the state's discretion over how that material is handled is also total. A site could be sealed, not because of what it contained, but because the chain of legal custody had become complicated enough that nobody with authority wanted to be the person who opened it back up. Bureaucratic inertia is a real force. It has entombed more than one discovery that deserved public attention, but the myths the bones generated do not come from bureaucratic inertia. They come from the scale. Patagonia has produced the largest land animals that ever walked this planet. That is documented, peer-reviewed, and not in serious dispute. Argentinosaurus, Patagoteton. Creatures that required structural engineering solutions no living biology has had to solve since. When images of partially exposed material circulate through private channels, and the scale of what is visible resists immediate comprehension, the myths that form are not invented from nothing. They are extrapolations from something real that the official record has not fully processed. The exaggerations around the ravine site, the whispered claims about multiple individuals, about carved walls, about material that did not behave like fossilized bone, grew from photographs that showed something the available frameworks could not cleanly contain. That is how legends form. Not from lies, but from evidence that outruns explanation. The documented paleontological reality is already extraordinary enough that embellishment should be unnecessary. The problem is that extraordinary reality was being managed rather than communicated, and managed absence produces mythology faster than managed presence ever could. If the Argentine state had published Ferreira's photographs alongside a clear scientific accounting of what the site contained, the rumours would have had nowhere to take root. They chose the alternative. The rumours filled the space they left. What the last photographer's story actually reveals is something about the architecture of discovery. Major finds do not belong to the public by default. They belong to whoever controls the ground, the permits, the filing systems, and the legal designations. Ferreira got into that ravine because one rancher decided that the bones deserved a witness. That is an unstable mechanism for preserving knowledge. It depends on individual conscience rather than institutional structure. An individual conscience can be bought, reassigned, or outlived. The ravine in Chubut is still there. The review is still pending. The bones, whatever they are still in the western wall. And Christian Ferreira's photographs still exist in a small number of private hands, undiscredited and unpublished, waiting for the institutional will to either examine them honestly or explain, on the record, why they never will. Look at the evidence, then decide what the silence is protecting.